So it's week 12. We started our Express server. It's not loading our views right now because we need to launch our client-side server as well. So I'll leave my one command window open, and now I'm going to go into my client directory and run ng-serve -- open. So Angular is going to compile our front end code. And we have a okay. We deleted our whoops. Sorry, in here this should be app root. That was the original Angular component that goes here. We're going to replace it. That's kind of the default template. It gives us a tag of app root, which links to our app component, which is pre-built by the Angular CLI, which loads this app component.html. So it's an HTML template, which we have here. So this is what I get, basically a blank page with a header and footer right now. So we're going to create, we want to create our own component. We're not going to use this kind of empty one. We're going to create a car component in Angular that describes what a car looks like, has the properties, and then we can inject this component into our view. So we can first of all show a list of cars. Now we already set up last week in our server folder, we modified our cars controller. So the get, rather than loading a view, it just fetches the list of cars from the database and returns it as a JSON object. If we try to go to localhost 3000/cars, we get all of the data, but just in JSON format. So we now want to connect these two sides up. We want to take this JSON data, we want to call the JSON data in our API, and we want to generate an HTML table over in the front end. So if you go to localhost 3000/cars, you should get something looking like this. All of your car data in JSON. Get that coming up? So we had this working last week. If you weren't here last week, the files are on GitHub. Now, Angular puts, by default, creates this app folder, and this initial app component is here. Delete that folder. We want to move it somewhere else. So we created this services folder. I want to create a components folder inside here. So if you go into client, source, and app, we want to create a new directory called components. So the car component we're going to build is going to go in this folder. And then this car service is going to go in the services folder we have here. We don't have to put these in separate folders. We could put them all in the app folder, but it's going to get big and it's going to get messy. They're different types of files with different purposes. So we would normally put all the components in a component folder and all the services in a services folder. I need to stop my server here, or else I can leave it running, but I need another command prompt inside the client folder. So we created our component manually last week. We're going to recreate it, get it auto-generated, which is going to be more efficient. So I've got 2 command windows already running, one running the Express server, one running the Angular server. I want to leave both of these running, so I need one more command prompt. I'll grab my URL. We want to go into our new client directory. And then we want to go into the source directory, src. Then we want to go into the app components directory. So there's the path we want to be in, the root folder, client, source, src, app components. So from here, we can actually use an Angular command to generate the component for us. So that command is going to start with ng generate component. And our cars will typically have the same name as our controller. So we have a controller called cars. We'll create a component with the same name. ng generate component cars. And we're inside of our client source app components. So it creates 4 files. It creates the component in TypeScript. That's the file with the .ts extension. It creates an HTML and a CSS file. Well, we'll need the HTML file. We won't need the CSS file. We'll just change the CSS just to use Bootstrap globally. And it's updated our source app module.ts. So we can kind of go in here and see what's going on. So this file's been changed. These were me playing around. So this line got added. Our new component was automatically imported, and it was declared here. I think our Bootstrap right now says this. I have a few extra things in mine. I'll have to take them out, and we'll have to add them. So your app.module.ts, it should look like mine. Is this what yours looks like, or is there anything different? I'm assuming yours looks like this. So this file is just in client, source, and app. This last one here. Oh, and you probably don't have these 2 lines. Right, so it looks like this. So it added automatically the cars component in. It's saying this component is part of our application. This is like our Angular setup file, basically. So now in this Bootstrap, let's change this. The Bootstrap is what is the default component. When Angular loads, which component does it load first? So right now, it loads this one that shows this kind of like Angular starter screen. This is how we left it before I broke it. So we don't want it to show this page. We want it to show this new page that got created. So it automatically builds this. It says cars works. Obviously, we're going to change this. So if we want to change what loads by default, in our app module.ts, instead of bootstrapping from the app component, let's bootstrap from the cars component. We don't want to show the Angular template. We want to show the one we're going to work on. When I save this on line 15, change my bootstrap. And go back right now, notice the Angular screen goes away. So then how do we load that page? Why didn't it load that page that says cars works? There's one other place we have to change it, which is our index.html. It's still loading the Angular component, this app root. Right? There's the selector. Oops. Instead, we want it to load app cars. So we want to change our view right now is using the original component. We want to change it to use our car component. So we're going to change this tag on index.html. So we want to change app root app cars. And if we go back to the browser now, our page should say cars works in between our header and footer. I notice as soon as I go back, it's already updated. So these Angular tags, this represents the component that we're injecting into our HTML page. So now what we need to do is we want to modify this page so that it can start to call our API, fetch the list of cars in JSON, and then show them in an HTML table. So let's take this out on our cars component. Just put on an H1 here. Says car tracker. We can start to create a table. If you're wondering where did I put the CSS, because it's coming up with Bootstrap, inside of assets and CSS, I just copied Bootstrap. And now we can put our table headings on. These should be TH tags. If I go back to my browser now, even without a reload, we should get this heading showing up and we should get our table start showing up at the top of our page. No data in it yet, but at least the start of our table. So it looks much like the original car tracker, nav bar, footer, and our table. So we've started our Angular component and HTML with Angular View, but this is where we need the service. The service is the bridge between this HTML Angular front end, and we need to bridge it so that it can call our Express controller backend and get our list of cars. So we used, just to review what we just did, we used ng generate component cars to create this, and it put it in a subfolder for us, which is nice, right? Each component then will wind up in its own folder. We modified our app module.ts, which is our Angular configuration file. Actually, the generator modified this for us. It referenced our new component and declared it, but we've changed the bootstrap. So our cars component is the initial piece that shows up. the nav bar, and we changed app root. Instead of loading our initial app component, we're now loading our cars component when the page loads. So if we want to let the user see different pages, it actually all still just happens in index.html. We can just show or hide different components by swapping using logic to show or hide different tags. So the user never actually leaves index.html. We're just injecting different components in the middle of it. So now we need to create our service and then let our service bridge call our REST API on the back end to get our cars in JSON. And then we also need to pass the data to the Angular component so that we can populate this table. So we'll need to use a loop, but we'll be using an Angular loop to do this, which is actually fairly similar to an EJS loop. I actually think it's a little simpler. So I'm going to go back to this command window here where I created my component. And I want to go out of the component folder, so up one level, and then back down into the services level. And just like we generated a component with ng-generate component, we can generate a service. So we don't have to build it manually. Angular will build it, build the file we need for us. So I'll do cd ... and I'm back in my app folder. And then we'll try cd services. We went out of app components, back up to app, and now down into services. So now we can run the command ng-generate service. Instead of cars plural, kind of use a similar naming convention we did here. We name our controllers plural with an S, and we name our model singular with no S. We'll do the same with Angular. Our components will be plural with an S, and our service will be singular. So I'll just call this ng-generate service car. And this will start to build out a service for us, which we're going to have to fill in. So it creates, there's no HTML and CSS file created here. It just creates a TypeScript file. So it will generate a service, ng-generate service car. This spec file we don't really need to worry about. That's just used for the compilation for transpiling the TypeScript into JavaScript, which happens automatically. We don't need to do it ourselves. So inside of services, we can open up our car service. So it's basically an empty file. It's injectable, so we can pass it into our component. It's public with export. So this is basically blank. So what we'll need to do in our service is write an Angular equivalent of all of the methods in our Express controller. We'll need a get, we'll need a create, we'll need an update, and we'll need a delete. So this file is the interface between calling our Express server on the back end and passing and receiving data from the Angular component on the front end. Okay. So this kind of performs the same function that our Express controller did when we weren't using Angular, right? It was the go-between, the middleman or the messenger between the EJS views and the Mongoose models. Now that role is kind of taken by the Angular service. So if this file, which runs in our client server, right, it runs in port 4200, it has to be able to talk to this one. So it's going to do that by using the URL, the same URL we used in our browser, right? This is how I called my API. I need the address, and I call the URL. In order for our service to call the server with the API, it needs to make HTTP requests: get, post, put, delete. So we need to add a reference here because right now this is not set up to use HTTP to call our service. So we're going to import a library. We're going to import Angular's HTTP library. Without this, we can't make a GET request to our Express API. Now it has this one default empty method here called Constructor. Some of you have probably heard this term before, especially if you've learned Java, ever learned Java. What is a constructor? What does it do? It's kind of a special method name. Yeah, when we want to create our service, we call the constructor. So it's like a startup. So this is a method to create So in here, when we call our constructor, we need to also create an instance of the HTTP library. So whenever our service gets used, it needs to have an instance of the HTTP library available. So we can write simple get method. So this get method needs to call the get method in our server API. This is where we use the HTTP library. Which method are we going to call here? It's in the list. To select all the cars. Yeah, we'll call the get method. And it wants to know the URL. So what URL do we call to fetch the list of cars in JSON? I already did it in my browser. What URL did I call? Right, so HTTP host 3000 cars. So we're going to make a GET request to our server API. The server API uses the Mongoose model to fetch the data from MongoDB and return it back as JSON. Right here. I've called it in the browser. We want to call it from our Angular service. So this gives us, when we call get in our service, this returns all the data. Now, right now, I've hard-coded the URL. Probably not the best place for it. We probably will want to move that to our configuration file. Let's see if we can get it to work first. If we can successfully get the data, we'll then replace this with a variable and store this in our configuration file, in a configuration file instead. Or at least, yeah, actually, that's what we want to do. So there's our service. Now I want to go back to this file, this appmodule.ts. This is our Angular startup file. So we also need to add a reference to our service here. So we're going to import our car service. And we're also going to add it here on line 17 in this providers section. The providers, that means what services are providing data, giving data to the Angular application, right? All our data, in this case, is coming through the car service. We want to add our car service here. Now, I think there's one more core Angular library that we're going to need. We'll try it without it. We may have to add one more reference. We may not. We'll try this and see. So the last thing we need to do is we need to connect these up. Our service now calls our API. But now we need to go to our car component. So when our car component is initialized, we want it right away to call the service and fetch the list of cars. So when a user comes to this page, our data is automatically populated. As soon as they load this, it goes and fetches the data from the server and shows our cars. So we need to import our service, first of all. That's nice the way WebStorm, as soon as I type it, right, it fills out the path automatically for me. It knows where to find our service. Because the service is supplying the data to this component. And this component, also when we do add, edit, and delete, it will pass data to the service. So they work together. So whenever our car component gets created, we also want to create an instance of our service. The component is never going to run without the service. They have to work together. So our component is going to have a cars property. Later on, for adding, editing, or deleting a single car, it's going to have a make, a model, a year, and a color property. We'll add those later. So we can just declare this of type any because it's a list. Later on, things like our make, model, those will have string properties. Our year will have an integer property or number property. So now we want to add a get method that calls this get method, takes the JSON and hands it back to our view. So we wrote a get cars method in the control in our service. We need a get cars method. We say it's void, much like in C#. So list all cars. So we're calling the get method in the service. It calls the get method in the API. Now what we have to do, there's a few different formats, a few different ways we could ask for this data. And what we're going to use is what's called we're going to use this method subscribe. This basically means it's an asynchronous call or a non-blocking call. So as we're trying to fetch the data from the server, if our Angular application wants to do other things in the meantime, it can. We're not really doing anything else, but we have the ability to. Our call will be non-blocking. So we'll subscribe. and we'll get back curly brackets. So whatever data we get back from calling our service, we're going to populate it in our cars. And then we can loop through this cars object in our HTML. The component calls the service calls the API. The API fetches the data, hands it back to the service, which hands it back to the component, which is injected in the HTML. So there's a lot of steps, a lot of layers here. Now, the last thing we want to do is on this method, this ng on init, we want to call get cars. So as soon as you create the component, it fetches the current list automatically every time. Right now, I can save this, but our page is still blank. Right? We still don't have anything here. So on init, we want to call this dot the get cars method in this file. Now, we're not seeing anything yet. I think our code's actually correct. Let's have a look over here. So I'm going to check my console. We're not even getting our heading anymore that says car tracker in the table. So something's probably gone wrong. And there's one of a couple possibilities. There may actually be two things we need to do. Okay. So here's our error. No provider for HTTP client. So we need to make one more reference. It's trying to use the HTTP client in our component, but it's throwing an error saying there is no provider. So we've included our HTTP client here, which is good. But our problem is in app module. We need to add one more thing here. So we need to add a reference as well here to the HTTP client module. Add a reference here. And in our providers, we need to add that here as well. In order to call our service, we need that reference. So we've added line 3, and we've modified line 18. I'm just going to check if this, what result we get now. Okay, so that's still working. We'll just try it again. Okay. Whoops, sorry, I put this in the wrong place. It's not a provider. It's in this imports section. Put it in the wrong section. Providers are our service, so this HTTP client module goes on line 16. I think that should fix our issue, hopefully. Okay, that did fix that issue. Notice that error of HTTP client error is gone. So again, I moved the HTTP client to my import statement. So we have a different error now. Our Angular piece is all actually working properly. If we inspect the error, it says a cross-origin request was blocked. The origin policy disallows reading a remote resource at localhost 3000 because our CORS header to allow control origin is missing. What does this mean in plain language? What's happening here? Yeah, it's a permissions problem. By default, JavaScript doesn't let you call, because we're on localhost 4200. It won't let us make a JavaScript call to localhost 3000. It's considered a different server. So by default, this is called CORS, cross-origin resources. And most servers block this by default. If you're on Azure, there's a setting in Azure down on the left nav for one of your websites called CORS, where you can go in and specifically enable it. You can say, I'm allowing JavaScript requests from this other domain. Or I can put in a star and I'll allow JavaScript requests from any domain, which is pretty dangerous. So what we need to do here, it's saying our CORS header is missing. So therefore, if we add some kind of header saying this is okay, this error will go away. So we actually have to do that in here. We'll add a couple of lines in our controller that sends the required header. And then our data should show up and we'll take a break. Armand, you can get coffee soon, 5 minutes. I see you doing the head bobs. I know it's early. So let's open up our server controller cars. We're back in our good old Express controller, which everyone's comfortable with. It's not new and complicated and weird like Angular. So up at the top here, because all of our requests get, post, put, they're all going to throw this error, we want to just add this header kind of globally in the controller. All the methods will use it. So if we add router.use and we don't put in any path at all, it gets used for every path in the controller. So we don't have to specify a particular path. This will be global. So in here, we've got our usual request, response, next. Whoops, sorry. That should be. So we just want to set these headings. So here are the headers we need to set. Called access control, allow origin. But we'll just put it in a star. Could put it in as localhost 3000, but then if we deploy it online, it doesn't work again. And then we also have to set the access control Now we also have to set what methods we're going to allow, which are going to basically be all the HTTP methods. We'll accept get, post, put, delete. And then we call next. So this happens because we haven't specified one path. It happens before any of the methods in the controller. And then we just call next. So this will get around this JavaScript authentication problem. And it will allow our client server on port 4200 to make HTTP calls using JavaScript to our server on port 3000. I'll save that. NodeMon should restart our server. And now we should be able to try. We won't see the data in our page, but hopefully we'll see the heading, the H1 that says car tracker, and our table heading should come back. Hopefully. There. So it's automatically updated. So adding those, allowing cores to run fixes our problem. So this is not a Node Angular. This is a JavaScript issue. So you should be aware of this if you're doing plain JavaScript. If you're using Ajax, for example, Scott was having this issue the other day in his client-side scripting class when they were making Ajax calls to a remote API. He said the problem is CORS keeps blocking it. And we, in debugging that, realized it was going to affect what we were doing as well. So whenever we're using JavaScript to call another server with JavaScript, by default, we're going to get this problem unless specifically our server end says, yes, it's okay, we'll accept requests. Here. Okay, so our data is not showing up yet. If I clear this and refresh, oops. Sorry, this is not res.next, it's just next. There's our next parameter that we haven't used yet. So then call the next method, but do this first. So no errors here. Finally, our page loads. We don't have any data here, but representing the data on our page will be easy. We'll look at how to do a loop in Angular. Not very complicated. But our page does have the data. It can successfully call our API. We just need to output the data. So what we'll do is we'll take a 10-minute break here. I'm going to stop the video stream. I will upload everything I've done to GitHub so far, and we'll resume in 10 minutes with showing the data, and then we can do a form for creating, and we'll see how far we can get with doing edit and delete. Let's take a break.